Hi. Okay. Commerce Clause video lecture number 4. This one's simply on um, National Federation of Independent Businesses, NFIB, against Sebelius, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is the case about the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, or just the Affordable Care Act, or just Obamacare. We're going to call it the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. And this was a comprehensive reform of the nation's healthcare financing system. The opinions in the case are not in the Brettschneider text that I assigned. I'm assuming they'll be in the next edition, which is almost out. You can find them in a PDF file on NYU classes in the folder labeled February 25th. Alright, so this is going to take a little bit of time, which is why I wanted to make a 4th video. Cheers. A couple more sips and I'll be showing you my basement office here. My family's much happier with me down in the basement. I'm very messy and disorganized and scattered. By the way, that's my first beer and I've had 4 ounces, so I'm perfectly fine. Okay, don't think anything's going on here. I want to talk about the provisions and provide some context and also sort of speculate about what Roberts is up to. It's a fascinating topic. So this will take a little bit of time. So one key issue obviously the key issue in the case is what became known as the individual mandate of the law. Very complicated law. So I'm on slide 20 of the third PowerPoint. This part of the law, the individual mandate, required most Americans, some were exempt, but most Americans to maintain what the law called minimum essential health insurance coverage. Minimum essential health insurance coverage. Many people already have it, right? They have it through their employer, they get it from the government, they're carried on somebody who has it from an employer or government. But as Justice Ginsburg in her dissent in the Sebelius case notes, as of 2009, about 50 million Americans had no coverage, right? And they have no coverage either by choice or, I think probably more likely because it's very expensive and they can't afford it. So the ACA mandates that most people have coverage, that they buy coverage if they don't have it. Now, the Obama administration and Congress are saying, we're going to make it more affordable. That's why we're calling it the Affordable Care Act. We're going to try to make it more affordable. But if you don't purchase if you don't have it and you don't purchase it, and there are government subsidized options for purchasing it, but if you don't do it, you're going to have to pay what the law calls in several places a penalty. It's also called a shared responsibility payment, right? And the amount varies. There's a scale according to your income, but you pay it when you file and pay taxes. You pay it to the IRS, and the fine, penalty, tax, we could call it a tax if we wanted to. Roberts wants to. Runs, on average $1,500 to $2,000 a year. In the run-up to the legislation, it's worth noting, President Obama does not want to call it a tax because new taxes are politically unpopular, so he's concerned not to call it a tax. So let me just add a word before we get into the case and the other issue in the case. A word about the logic of this individual mandate, right? Because our excerpts don't completely sort of reveal it. They hint at it. There are snippets here and there. But if you haven't read about this enormously complicated law, this is a very sort of Cliff Notes version of what is the administration thinking, and what is Congress thinking when it has this mandate in there. And Ginsburg gives us some of this. Her full opinion would give you a much fuller account. The central problem is free riding and fee shifting, right? The uninsured, people who have no coverage, often do seek health insurance. They often need it. That's often a dire need. Often they're going to emergency rooms, right? They can't be turned away. This is the kind of a new moral problem, right? I mean, it's morally horrific if somebody needs health care, might even face a disabling or life-threatening condition, and it's simply their inability to afford it that prevents them from getting it. It's hard for us to live with the medical ability to solve the problem, to provide a remedy, and having people's economic need not allow them to pay for it, right? So people without coverage really can't and don't pay the high costs of their care. They're not turned away, they're cared for. Providers don't eat the costs, right? They pass the costs on to the people who pay, the insurance companies or the government, and then the rest of us get, when we do have coverage, we get higher costs, we pay higher premiums. That's the fee shifting part of it, right? So premiums go up. Congress estimated that on average, people with coverage are paying, about $1,000 a year more than they otherwise would because of this problem of the uninsured receiving care and the cost of that care, the high cost of that care sometimes being passed on. Ginsburg also notes that if Congress wanted to, and this is true, it could simply go with the single payer model, the Canadian model, where the government is the payer, hence single payer. Or the model might be the federal Medicare program for the elderly. It could do that. It doesn't do that. It doesn't enact a radical reform. It works kind of with the existing institutional lay of the land that it confronts. That's a less risky, more conservative, and more politically popular way to go. Probably politically impossible to go to a single payer, one would think, in the American context. But there are many, once you say that, once you're not going to do single payer, you've got many complicated problems to solve. One big problem is the practice of insurance companies either denying coverage to people who are in ill health or have pre-existing conditions altogether, no coverage, or charging them a lot more for the health care, right? And if we think it's important to block that, to not allow the companies to do that, then okay, that's important, we do it, but it has certain implications, right? The law does require companies to cover all people, and this is called the law's guaranteed issue provision. And it also requires a method of determining and standardizing prices. I don't pretend to understand this, but it's called community rating, so that the price of the coverage can't be varied wildly depending on the company's risk assessment. Obviously, if you're for profit, you want to insure healthy people and not insure sick people, right? You make a lot more money that way. But community rating meets that making sure the prices aren't astronomical, and that the insurance companies can't vary the rates by their assessment of how risky you are. Now, if you do all that, there's a basic incentive for people not to have coverage, right? If I can go without it and not pay for it, and then when I need it, they have to give it to me, and they have to give it to me at an affordable rate. So to respond to that remaining incentive for the uncovered to stay uncovered, we get the individual mandate. You can't free ride. You either buy it and use it, and we'll subsidize it, we'll make it available, but if you don't, you're going to pay a fee, a tax, a penalty. Okay, so that's one area that's at issue in the Sebelius cases, the constitutionality of the individual mandate. The second issue, which doesn't concern us, but it's interesting enough in terms of federalism, does concern us. We're concerned with federalism. To talk a little bit about it, right, is the Affordable Care Act's expansion of the national government's Medicaid program. Medicaid is government-funded health insurance for the poor. It's a joint federal-state program. The federal government pays part, the states pay part, sometimes localities pay part. Before the ACA, federal law does not require the states to insure every poor individual, only certain categories, and it gives the states a measure of leeway about the benefits package. Now, I should back up and say when the federal government says to the states, you can have a lot of money from us if you have a Medicaid program, but you have to follow the strings attached to it, right? To get the money, you have to meet the requirements we set out. Congress does this a lot. It can't directly do certain things under the Constitution, but it can give an incentive to the states to do them by attaching strings to grants and aid. You don't have to take this money, this wonderful money, to build great highways. But if you do, you agree to lower your speed limits. Just like that, right? So strings attached to the money. So this involves the use of Congress's enumerated power to spend, not its commerce power. And here, similarly, the court had not invalidated a use of the spending power with strings attached since 1936, but in this case it did. That's significant. So what the Affordable Care Act did with Medicaid was change the strings. And it said to the states, in order for you to get any Medicaid funds at all, you must cover all individuals under the age of 65 who are with incomes below 133% of the federal poverty line. And that's not a lot. That's like $17,000 in annual income. So you cover everyone. Many of these people are not now included in Medicaid. And also, we have a new sort of set of requirements about the benefits that have to be provided, right? A minimum benefits package. And we, the feds, will cover 100% of the increased costs until 2016, and then 90% of your additional costs thereafter. So you can foresee, additional revenue, additional taxes and revenues, arguably, in the future, right? So this sets up the two big issues in the case. Hey, slide 25. Wow, time flies, right? Slide 25 on the third PowerPoint. Two big issues. Is the individual mandate constitutional? And you want to note there are two sub-issues here. A, is the individual mandate constitutional as a valid exercise of Congress's commerce power? B, is the individual mandate properly called a tax? And if it's a tax, can it be valid as an exercise of Congress's enumerated power to tax, which is a separate enumerated power? And on the Commerce Clause issue, what's the relevance or significance of the necessary and proper clause? Would this be a means to some other valid end that could be upheld, in Commerce Clause in combination with the necessary and proper clause? Second issue is whether the expansion of the Medicaid program exceeds Congress's spending power, the new strings attached to Medicaid funds, and the long recognized power of Congress to attach these strings because it is too coercive. It's too much. It's a gun to the state's head. It commandeers the states, takes them over to carry out a federal program. Okay, so let's just do the holding. So the holding is on slide 26. On the first issue, Justice Roberts makes, sorry, my notes are a little out of order. Justice Roberts makes 5 votes for 2 propositions. With the 4 conservatives, Scalia, Thomas, Kennedy, and Alito, he makes 5 votes for the holding that Congress cannot do the individual mandate under its Commerce Clause power. That exceeds Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. We'll talk about why they think that's the case in a minute. But B, can be called a tax, and it is a valid exercise of Congress's power to tax. So the individual mandate survives; it's upheld, right? And the 5 votes for it being a tax are Roberts, Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, the 4 liberals, with Roberts for it's okay as a tax, right? It's kind of it's arresting that 4 justices would strike down the whole law in its entirety, right? The conservatives want that outcome. So what is Roberts doing, and why is he doing it? On the second issue, now I find this one really puzzling, right? This is just strange to me. Roberts and 6 other justices, so Breyer and Kagan, join this view that the strings attached to the Medicaid changes are too coercive, and Congress can't do this, that it violates some principle of federalism for Congress to threaten the states with defunding all Medicaid funds if they don't go along with the requirements of the law to insure everybody and provide a certain benefits package, right? I don't know why Breyer and Kagan are there. It's a mystery to me. Maybe there's some deal, or maybe they're persuaded by the federalism argument, or maybe they like the rewrite of the law. The court actually rewrites the statute. It doesn't just say, no, that's not okay. It says, but, this would be okay. So there is a kind of a blow to the integrity of the entire program, and it allows states not to do this, and indeed many states, 23, 24, controlled by Republican administrations and legislatures, don't participate in it. They can choose to opt out of the Medicaid expansion. All right, so let's talk about the Roberts opinion and the reasoning in it. I'm on slide 27 now. I find it interesting that he begins and he says several times that we're not here to decide whether the ACA is sound or good public policy. At one point later, he says, it is not our job to protect the people from the consequences of their political choices. I mean, the intimation is this is really dumb, stupid policy, but that's not my question. You really can't avoid. He says he does that so many times that you can't avoid thinking that he thinks it's bad policy. At the heart of the argument about the Commerce Clause, he opens with a discussion of federalism and general principles about federalism, and we've seen all this before. There's a limit. We've never said there wasn't a limit, right? On pages 436 and 437 of the PDF file, we get his argument for the proposition that you can't sustain this as a valid exercise of the Commerce Clause. All right, preliminarily, we might ask why he bothers to do it, right? The conventional view is he's going to go on to uphold it as a valid tax. He shouldn't say anything about whether it could be upheld or not under the Commerce Clause. That's just not the conventional way the court handles constitutional issues. It doesn't address them unless it has to. Yeah, unless, he's playing the longer game about doctrine. And here he's reinvigorating Lopez and Morrison. And he's making a point that I think he thinks it's important to make. The argument on the Commerce Clause here, he wants it out there. He wants people to think about it. And it turns on the distinction between activity and inactivity. So the key point, I think, is, he says, the regulation of interstate commerce, quote, presupposes the existence of commercial activity to regulate. If this becomes the law, right, he's defined the activity that you can regulate as commercial, right, which is narrower than an economic class of activities, right? Or at the very least, some activity that has a substantial effect on interstate commerce. Here we don't have activity, we have inactivity. Existing, breathing. You're not buying health insurance. That's what's being regulated, right? And where does that logic of making you do something, making you engage in an economic transaction with a private company, where does that end? Can the Congress make you buy a car because the car industry is in trouble? He seems to say yes, that's implied, right? Or can it make you eat a healthy diet? Um, well, okay. Does that analogy hold? Right. So I'm on slide 28 now. Could they make you buy and eat broccoli if they can do this? Does the analogy hold? The government argues that the market is unique. Everyone will need it. Everyone's going to be in it at some point. The costs of the uninsured will be passed on to the insured. It's a very complicated national market. This provision is part of a broader picture of coherence that is designed to extend health insurance and bring down the costs. Is it more like a consumer, I'm on slide 28 now, asking and receiving broccoli at a store and then walking out without paying for it? We could call the decision the action. We could say that what's being regulated is the decision not to buy health care. We could make that the activity, I suppose. That's kind of funky semantically. But Roberts will have none of this. It is a little bit unprecedented, mandating that you purchase a product from a private company, right? The government does make me have car insurance. I have to buy that. But if I don't want to buy it, I can just decide not to drive a car. So that may not be the exact same case, right? The necessary and proper clause doesn't help the government here because that's a derivative idea. If there's no activity to regulate, then you can't use the necessary and proper clause because the power isn't there in the first place. That's his argument under that. He goes on to uphold the individual mandate as a valid exercise of the taxing power. Is it a punishment, a penalty, a tax, a fine, a fee? Well, it's permissible as a tax, so it's upheld. All right, and then finally on page 439 of the PDF, we get the decision to strike down the expansion of the Medicaid program, whereby the federal government would withdraw all Medicaid funds if the states didn't go along. And he says that the most the national government can do is to deny the increment if you don't go along. So if you don't go along, you don't get what you would have gotten had you gone along. But we can't take away the existing funds because it's too coercive and it violates principles of federalism. Right? This is a really sort of I just don't see the basis for this, right? As Ginsburg says in dissent, Congress could wipe out the existing Medicaid program by legislation and then legislate a new one with these terms. And then you could take or leave the money. See, that's the trick. That's the thing. The court hasn't invalidated these coercive uses of the spending power before. It makes no effort to make this one sort of comport with other cases where this kind of thing has been allowed, and it throws into question, this kind of use of it. So it's really a very strong assertion of federalism principles, right? And there's 7 votes for the proposition. The Ginsburg dissent, we've kind of gone over it in the critique of the Roberts opinion. She places it in context. She says it makes sense. She attacks the Medicaid argument as well. I think we can sort of speculate about what Roberts is up to. I suppose he could have joined the 4 other conservatives, and then we'd get a decision striking it down completely. What would that mean for politics? What would that mean for the upcoming 2012 election? Is he making a political calculation? I do think the fact that he addresses the Commerce Clause claim at length and rules against it is a claim for the future of doctrine. The tax power as a power to regulate is how to put this? Taxes are unpopular, right? So if that's what Congress is left with here, okay, this survives, but there's a further limitation on its Commerce Clause power, right? And the Medicaid ruling really is, again, you really go back to this idea of the states are really important autonomous governments in their own right, and they shouldn't be subjected to this sort of financial pressure, which gives them no choice, right? It really does. The deprivation of all Medicaid funds is a huge part of their budget. But we've never said that Congress can't attach strings to its money unless the strings require the states to do something that clearly violates other constitutional norms or provisions like freedom of speech. So it's a very interesting kind of way of handling the case. Thinking about these cases overall, we do have to think about the underlying federalism arguments, right? So we could decide that the doctrinal moves don't make a lot of sense, that this distinction between economic and non-economic activity is kind of window dressing, but still agree with the ideological thrust of the need to place limits and the checking and balancing, even if we view the court as kind of a third legislative branch. Is it playing a useful role in making people think more carefully about exertions of national power? On the other hand, the liberal case depends on the clumsiness, the incoherence of judicial tools of management here. The categories don't do the work of giving us a coherent picture of limitations on federal power. And the democratic process is adequate to constraining and confining an overreach of national power. Most governance is complicated and cooperative now. And maybe these decisions are really getting in the way or threaten to get in the way. But it's very much up in the air. So with that, at 27 minutes, we'll end. So you have four videos now on this stuff to help you review. And I will see you Thursday. Bye.